kidnapping, suicide, and class action lawsuits. That's what we're going to talk about today. So, Matt, there's been a lot of stuff going on in the legal boundary space of AI, and I want to go over in a little bit more detail than we talked about before some of the things that have been happening. So, last week there was this situation where I don't know if you saw this in the news, but there was a mom in Arizona who got a call saying that her daughter had been kidnapped, and the voice on the call, you heard her daughter's voice, you heard an unidentified man or a couple unidentified men. There were some threats, and then they asked for $1 million ransom. They eventually lowered that to $500,000. But the interesting thing is, the daughter was not kidnapped. It was a complete scam. The voice was fabricated using, I don't know if it was 11 Labs or something better. A couple episodes ago, in episode 2, we replicated both of our voices, and it definitely it was pretty good, but it was not quite the same as us. And I looked at some of the approximate transcript of that call, and there's a lot of like crying and sobbing. I couldn't find the actual audio file, but I do wonder, I guess the mom's already probably primed, like she gets a call from her daughter being like, "Oh, mom, I messed
Yeah.
up, I fucked up, I please help me," and there's crying and sobbing going on. Like, she's probably not listening for necessarily a lot of those little clues. But it is interesting because when we replicated our voices, one of the things that I felt like it was missing was some of that like human intonation. Like it was okay. It was sort of monotonous though, right? It sort of was like many humans talking in a monotonous tone. Believable, but not emotional. So I'm curious how they, what did they use to get that a level of emotion in there? Um, and then also, like, how common is this going to be?
Yeah, I did see this case, and I'm trying to remember the specifics of it, but I had the same questions as you did. I was so curious how this girl's mom couldn't recognize the difference in the AI generated voice and her daughter's own voice. But like you said, I think when you're so primed in that moment to be under like emotional distress, it's probably so much easier to like let those things slip. And I'm really curious, like you said, what they ended up using because there was not much emotion behind the voice when we did our 11 Labs test. And also, if there's crying in it, like how are you actually
Yeah.
able to get that to generate through an AI model? That is something
I,
that's
I
like,
wonder, if you could generate the crying separately, maybe using a separate model, and then almost like I think 11 Labs works, right? It creates some sort of like footprint of your intonation, even though it doesn't create a lot of intonation. It creates enough that like the pattern of your speech is sort of similar. And so if you could just impose that on like an existing, or like a stock recording of crying.
yeah. I- And I'm also, you know what, I'm really curious about how targeted this attack was. So let's say I'm a father and someone tries to pull this on me. They would probably have intimate knowledge about my son or daughter to be able to pull something like this off, right? Because in the article, the daughter was on a ski trip, I believe,
Yeah.
potentially with her dad, I want to say. And you like either have to get really lucky as the scammer to like not have that mom's daughter right next to her as the call is
Oh, I think
happening,
they
or
definitely must have known. I think that was definitely planned. It was timed because yeah, it was very precise. Like the daughter was gone on the ski trip. In the absence of that, it doesn't really make sense. They also would have had to do enough surveillance on her to get the audio clips, right? Because
yeah,
according to the mom, there was not
she didn't
any
have much
significant
around.
video or voice footage on her social media, on the daughter's social media. So they would have had to get. It looked like there were a couple like lengthy clips of her from school. So
Hmm.
they would have had to dig into her a little bit. Also, the location, right? The mom and the family, right? They live in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is one of the wealthiest areas of Arizona. So I think it was probably a pretty targeted attack. They found like, oh, this is someone is moderately wealthy, and we know that the daughter is going to go on a ski trip. I saw some photos of the daughter. It looks like the daughter might be like a pretty serious skier. Like I'm not sure if she
Mm.
tried out for the Olympics or something like that, but she seemed to be, maybe approximating pro level or aspiring pro level skier. So I think that probably, was partially responsible for her selection as the victim, um, because enough people would have seen her and they could have guessed at like, oh, maybe she's from a wealthy family. If you're 15 years old and like approximating a pro level skier, I mean, you probably get to train a lot. Skiing is expensive. If you're wearing expensive gear, it's a pretty good guess that your parents are wealthy, and then like maybe they can pay a
Right.
ransom.
Yeah, exactly. I am like sort of curious, like you said, how often something like this is going to happen. I wonder how much setup was involved in that on the scammers end. Did they? I didn't read the full article, I don't think, but did they catch him or like find any sort of motive
Not
outside
as
of
far as
just
I
like?
know. As far as I know, they have not caught them. There was a quote from an FBI agent who was at the Phoenix office and involved with the case, and he said that it happens basically daily that they get these calls. So
Really?
yeah, like it's not always a scam kidnapping, but it could be either a scam kidnapping or a fake family emergency. So like, oh, your son is in this, is traveling and he, got arrested by the local authorities and we have to get him out and you have to pay
But do
this
any
X
of
amount of
these
money.
involve AI, like
Yeah, yeah.
to this
So like
degree?
if you
Okay.
if you let them, yeah, I think the category as a whole, right, is much larger than one per day, but just sort of the AI cases is getting increasingly common.
Yeah, and I wonder how that ends up scaling. Like, can you do something to generate all of that setup, right? So you don't have to, as the scammer, make sure that this person's on a skiing trip yourself, or do all the setup that would be required to have that scam work successfully. Like, is that something that's automatable, or is that something that's just going to be like a bottleneck to doing something like that? Because if you can scale it, that's super scary. Like we
I
already
think you
see all
could
these
scale it because
robocalls.
think about it, right? Like I could create a system that, iterates through Instagram users or TikTok users, look for indicators, right? Like I could feed it into a like text to image or video to image description program that looks for cues of these kids look like they are wearing, expensive name brand products. And once I have that list of users, I then, create these voice copies. I'm gonna have to find phone numbers somehow, but there's a lot of databases that I can use to like try to find phone numbers. Even if I use any of these like numerous like people lookup databases, right? Like those are not always accurate, but let's say it's accurate 1 in 10 times, and then the other 9 times I send it to the wrong person. Like still, I can do like a mass send out of like, run it 100,000 times in one day. 1% of those, or the 10% of those go through. 10,000 calls in one day. People haven't necessarily heard of the scam yet. It's if I do this all at the same time, and
I'm
then
sure you
like
can get a
some
lot.
percentage of those are probably going to pay, which is a
Let
pretty
me,
scary like possibility.
yeah, totally. Let me ask you, have you ever used any services that require you to authenticate via your voice?
I Not that I can remember. I don't.
So there's like, it's not super common, but sometimes like financial services or things that
That's true.
really
Okay, I
want
take
to
that back.
secure.
I think like a few years ago, I maybe, I do vaguely recall some option, maybe for some bank, that gave me that option, and I don't think I used it. And I also haven't heard that option
Mhm.
again. So I don't know if that's been phased out
Yeah,
or if that is still an option. If that's still an option, that's pretty scary. I would imagine that's sort of almost like
that's what I'm
you're
saying,
just asleep at the wheel if
right? Like
that's still an option.
there's two questions that, or like thoughts I have around that is if that is something that is still being used actively or is going to like gain in popularity. Can something like an AI model recreate your voice enough to where it could dupe those? One, and then two, if we see a rise in things like this, can we see a system where like I might have voice, like true voice recordings of like my most trusted friends or family, and then there's some like behind the scenes happening on the telephone company's ends where it's like if you get some sort of like now that'd be way too complicated, but like some sort of safeguard against this happening where you hear this and like it can maybe block, like phase out those scam calls before they ever get to you. I don't know that there's like any
So
like
there's,
way
I
that
think
that
there was,
happens,
there's
but
some app that does this or tries to do this for robocalls, and it will basically answer. I think it might be built into iOS. I'm not an Apple user, so I'm not sure. I believe there's also an Android app for it, but it basically will answer a call, have a pause, and originally I think it was pretty simplistic, where it would just during that pause wait to see if the other side automatically started talking with some robo text, and then if so, it would just end the call, and if not, it would then pass it on to you. I think that's
Mm.
probably gotten a little bit more sophisticated since then, but I'm not sure, to what degree they're using that. And I'm also not sure, like, it doesn't seem that far of a stretch to make a system that's more adaptive now, right? Like if I'm the attacker, I can just wait during that pause until someone says hello, right? I'll just register some amount of, verbal input from the other side and then start playing. Also, I'm
But that
curious on the
also
other side,
requires you to be.
like this past
Go ahead.
attack, I'm curious if there was a person on the other side that was playing this, right? Because they had these recordings of Bree, they had these other voices, but presumably like they were interacting with the mom
That's a good
to
point.
some degree.
It was
And
it was
unfortunately we
in
don't
real
have the
time.
exact transcript. We have like pieces that were reported by the mom, but we don't have an exact transcript. So it's unclear whether, to what degree, if at all, it was adapting to what the mom was saying on the call.
You could have that happen though, right? Because with these large language models, like you can take in, an input from the mom, right, and on the fly generate voice text to reply to her,
You would
right?
you would
Which
have
is
to
like kind
be,
of the
I mean,
scary part.
yeah, you'd have to like I wonder what language model you'd have to use, probably not GPT. I doubt
Yeah, they're gonna
GPT
have
4 would
safeguards.
would
They
be
wouldn't
willing
allow
to.
you to
Yeah, exactly.
some dark web GPT maybe.
I mean, it's pretty interesting actually. I even like the other day I saw this article where somebody used this like 7 billion parameter, so much smaller, but still largish uh, LLM that ran in a browser, and they were just interacting with it, like testing sort of what it was capable of. And I mean, it's not as good as ChatGPT, but like it's pretty good. Like, and for something that you can run on your laptop, like that's an impressive thing. Like you can run this little like mini LLM in a browser, and it still is coherent. So like you
Yeah,
might be able to like do something, like train or fine tune a small model like that for
your own purposes
nefarious
in that
purposes.
manner. Yeah.
Which is, I mean, it's, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a terrifying like prospect. I don't really know what the level of like defenses that you do to defend against these. One of the things that the FBI agent in charge of the scam case talked about was just having like a, some sort of safe word, or something, a question answer, a challenge response system for your family. That's great if your family is like includes a cryptographer, but I don't think
No.
most people are going to
Yeah.
do that. So I'm not really sure, in a more automated fashion, how do you deal with this problem?
It sounds like the key to it is to stay analog and not be digital at all.
Not even have a phone.
Yeah, right,
Can't get a
exactly.
phone
That's
call
like
scam if you don't have a phone.
now we're thinking one step ahead. And that kind of
Back to
leads me to
telegraphs. And then it'll be
yeah, right. I'll
GPT
start.
that's just texting it out. I am your daughter.
Oh God. Do you think that like cybersecurity is going to be able to stay one step ahead of all these nefarious users for like these sorts of purposes? Like how are you able to keep? It just seems like that whack a mole where it's like it just another one pops up as soon as you whack it, right?
Yeah, I do think it's going to be hard. I'm not really sure what, what the future like developments there look like. There was an interesting um some cybersecurity article I was reading about recently that was cybersecurity and AI, and it was basically talking about, at a general level, it's like making offensive, pieces of software is easier than creating the defenses, because you just have to look for like one small hole, especially
Mm-hmm.
if these AI systems, which are there's involved like a human element. So it's much more like social engineering or smishing or phishing. It's not like up here like,
Right.
oh, I need to crack this encryption. So in that scenario, it's much easier to make a new offensive weapon than a defensive shield. But on the flip side, maybe there's more smart people working on defense than offense. Like you have like a really top-minded people. I don't know if that's true. I mean, you also have like nation state level actors, so like China
That's
and
I was going
Russia
to go
could
there
be
next.
channeling a lot of human capital into the offensive weapons. But so yeah, I mean it's a scary it's a scary prospect, especially because the space across which you can generate attacks is just enormous with the ability to generate like human text and human voice. Like you can do this via calls, via potentially in the future videos, via emails, via texts. Like it's just there's such a broad swath of areas that you can create just entire false personas. Like you could even create a
Right.
campaign, right, where I create a fake Instagram user or a fake TikTok user, and then all of the information and the content and the personality is just artificial, and I use that to get information from kids through kids accounts, right? Like that's a pretty scary, like terrifying possibility, and getting increasingly plausible.
Yeah, I think it. I mean, we could go down that rabbit hole in so many different angles of what is potentially like scary about that on the micro level, but I feel like I want to stick it up to the macro level a little bit more, where you had mentioned like the nation state level.
Yeah.
So the idea of regulating AI has been something that's been kind of going around the news lately.
Yeah.
I don't see a country like China doing something like that. And like, do you think that
I think
us
China will
maybe
definitely regulate
hamstringing
AI,
ourselves?
but they'll
You
regulate
think
it
so?
for private industry, and then within the CCP they will still be using
It's
it
a good point.
for
I'm
offensive
sure we will
purposes.
do the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. So there's this other thing. This happened a little bit ago, which was there was this Belgian guy Pierre who he committed suicide after talking to a chatbot named Eliza that's produced by
Mm.
a company called Chai Research. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah. So if we're talking about the same thing, he was worried about climate change, and
Yeah,
it told him,
yeah,
yeah.
super interesting,
Go
right?
ahead.
Like this guy, so apparently he had like a crippling level of like eco anxiety. He was super worried about global warming. Talked to this chatbot produced by Chai Research, which I looked in. There's different articles have vastly different numbers on how many users Chai Research has. So in one of the articles about this suicide, I saw the number of 5 million users. In a different article about Chai Research, I saw a number that was like either 100,000 or 500,000 users. So a pretty stark discrepancy. So I'm not sure how many users this company actually has. It looked like also I saw some conflicting information. One place said that it was uh, based out of some European country, and then another said it was headquartered in San Francisco. So not sure. Maybe the
So
team is
basically, we
split.
can't trust these
Yeah,
articles.
it's a
Yeah,
little
yeah,
bit
that's a good point.
unclear. The company is real though. The chatbot is real. I did verify that much. It's based on GBTJ, which is an open source AI model developed by Luther AI. It's much smaller,
Are we
but
positive that the suicide is real? Like, is that maybe just like, can we
so the
confirm that this
suicide, there is
person?
like a Belgian report that it looks pretty solid. Also, there was like some pretty high up level people in like the Belgian government who I think commented
Hmm.
on it. So I think it's pretty clear that the suicide happened. It's just bad reporting. Probably in translation something got mixed up because a lot of the info is based on this original like Belgian source article.
Did they subpoena the chat transcript? Like, did they have that
I'm not
available?
sure. Not that I saw.
Because I would be very interested to see like that full
It
transcript
would be
and how it went
a
down.
long
And
time because it sounded like so his wife commented in the original article and said that the guy became obsessed with this chatbot, and apparently it went on for
mm,
several weeks. So it was sort of like escalating for several weeks. Some of the interesting things that reportedly this chatbot included were or said in the discussions were um, he said that the wife and the guy who's married with kids, and the chatbot told him that his wife and kids were dead. um Interesting thing for a chatbot to say. Definitely not something you see from ChatGPT. This model is a little bit more fast and furious. um
yeah.
there was some sort of apparently ongoing conversation about Pierre and the chatbot becoming one, and the chatbot was supposedly encouraging this. Again, it is a little bit tough to say without looking at the transcripts, like what exactly is going on here. But it's interesting, I think, for several reasons legally, because I think, unfortunately, like this guy was already mentally ill before he had the chatbot. The chatbot sort of exacerbated it a little bit, maybe, or allowed him to like feed into his own fantasies.
Yeah.
Afterwards, Chai Research did um, change something in the model. So at least like if someone starts talking about suicide or something, that's like self harm, then there's a message that will come up and offer them, help. So they didn't block it entirely, which I think is probably good. Um, I don't know if you can get away from that entirely, but they do offer that helpline. So that's something.
Yeah.
But so no lawsuits have been issued so far. That's also potentially because they're in a different country. But I looked a little bit into the laws in the U.S. and it looks like so several states have laws to various degrees about which criminalize different types of assisting, and some states even encouraging suicide. So it's state by state in the US. But for example, here's Connecticut law. So Connecticut law specifically criminalizes two types of suicide assistance. The first is intentionally causing a person to commit suicide by force, duress, or deception, and that's classified as murder. So you could say that deception
With
includes
murder. Yeah.
telling someone that their wife and kids are dead. I don't know if that's causing someone to commit suicide, but it's definitely influencing it. So that's an interesting
You can
thing.
make the argument
Yeah,
for sure.
exactly. So if this guy had lived in Connecticut, maybe that would apply. If that doesn't apply, there's a weaker one. So instead of murder, it's still criminalized as manslaughter if you intentionally cause or aid a person other than by force, duress, or deception to commit suicide. That's aiding. So it's again unclear as to whether telling someone they should commit suicide is considered aiding. There are some states that have even more lenient laws, or not lenient, but less, there's a lower bar. So some
Mhm.
states seem to basically be saying, like, if you are encouraging someone to commit suicide, then that can also be a criminal act. So I think it's a pretty interesting thing because as these like chatbots get more common, this could be, one of the issues that comes up in a recurring fashion. And I think there's a decent chance that one of these laws in one of these states um, gets tested because you're going to have somebody will commit
And,
suicide after talking to their chatbot about something.
and what happens then? Like, what is the defense? One and two. Like, say there's some sort of like guilty ruling. What ends up happening? Would it just be something like OpenAI just gets fined? Are people going to jail?
So it could be.
What is
So
maybe
so
the
companies
outcome?
can be charged with crimes, which is an interesting thing that a lot of people don't realize. It happened with Trump's organization, the Trump organization, a few months ago, maybe. Um, and when a company is charged with a crime, a person isn't necessarily charged with a crime. So a company can be charged with a crime, and that can result in limits being put on the organization. The organization can pay a fine. They may be disbanded. There's numerous things that the government can do. That could happen, or it can also be a person that is held responsible. If one of these
Hmm.
went to court, and let's say that a chatbot company, the chatbot encouraged someone to commit suicide, that was tried under some state's law, and that was found to be a crime. I don't think any people would be held responsible. I think probably it would stay at the organizational level because there's no humans that were like intentionally complicit with that, right? They weren't
Doing
trying to
anything? Yeah.
encourage, but they did. So it was, the action was there, but without any intention, and without any direct human action. So my guess would be just that the organization was held liable, but that could still be like a pretty hefty thing, if nothing else, that that decision could result in that company having to change the way that they build their AIs, right? A condition of that
Hmm.
that criminal conviction could be that, hey, you can no longer use this AI. You have to bar discussions around certain topics like suicide or even self-harm, or maybe it goes so far as if for a particular company, the court says we actually don't think you can even handle anything related to mental health, so your chatbot is not allowed to talk about anything mental health, and maybe now that's like a difference between you and some competitor chatbot. So I do think it could be a pretty big deal in the US for companies to be hit with these types of lawsuits.
Let me ask a question. I would wager a bet that guns are probably the most widely used for suicide. Would you agree?
I do not know. I have no statistics on this.
They're probably high up there. Say I'm a gun manufacturer and somebody kills themselves with my gun. Does that, like, would I be liable at all? It sort of feels
So
very
that's
similar in that I'm.
so that's a good point. That was a highly debated topic. So I think there was some legislation. It did not used to be the case, and I'm not sure if that is the case now. I know it was proposed last year, maybe even earlier, but there was a big deal over like should we hold, you know, weapon manufacturers like liable for anything that's done with their weapons. It seems like a pretty tenuous I'm not sure that I think that's a great like legal situation to have. And you're right that it could be read into those sorts of laws, right? Like aiding. Um, so maybe the fact that we don't see gun manufacturers being held liable for suicide means that those state laws would be similarly read to not provide any liability to chatbot creators. That's possible. All right, so let's move on to another thing that happened in the legal AI space. We had the ChatGPT potentially defaming a politician. You brought this up, I think, in one of the past episodes. We had this
Yeah.
Australian mayor, Brian Hood, the mayor of Hepburnshire, which is just awesome. You want to be a mayor of a shire, not a city. I wish we had shires here in the U.S.
Man, me too.
So here's the story. I looked into it a little bit more after you mentioned it last time. So 2 decades ago, he was a whistleblower at the Reserve Bank of Australia, and he brought evidence of bribery to the authorities that exposed this scandal. But that's not what ChatGPT says. ChatGPT says that Brian Hood was the convicted criminal who served time in prison for bribery. So got correct the main characters and themes, Brian Hood, bribery, got the relationship totally wrong. Whistleblower, not perpetrator. So in response, Brian Hood, who has kind of built his reputation around being this person who exposes corporate villainy, and so this is quite like a
Hmm.
damaging thing to say that he was convicted of bribery. So his
For sure.
lawyer sent a letter to OpenAI on March 21st demanding that the company correct the misinformation within 28 days, or else Brian would sue. This is a quote from his lawyer. He says he's an elected official. His reputation is central to his role. He relies on a public record of shining a light on corporate misconduct, so it makes a difference to him if people in his community are accessing this information, this false information. So if that goes to court, that'll be super interesting. We're approaching the deadline. I haven't seen any update on that yet, and
That
so
hasn't
I
been
think
changed. Wow.
yeah, if that goes to court, then there's a few interesting things. So one argument that I've heard is there any difference between the liability to Mattel, a toy company, when a Magic 8 Ball answers yes to the question, is Brian Hood a criminal? And to the liability of
Hmm.
OpenAI when ChatGPT provides the same answer to that question. So in that context, it seems like OpenAI would not have any liability, which is interesting. Also, OpenAI does have a disclaimer, when you use ChatGPT that says this is experimental. I'm not sure exactly how it's
Hmm.
worded now. I think it's changed a couple times, but something like this is experimental. It produces false information. Don't believe everything it says without fact checking it. So that makes it seem a little bit harder for a lawsuit to go through, at least if it was in a US jurisdiction. I'm not familiar with how Australian defamation law works. Um, and then yeah, also given the fact that ChatGPT is essentially fancy autocorrect, what if I start typing in, Brian Hood is a in my phone, and then I get criminal as a completed, completion suggestion? Is that
It feels like, yeah, it feels like there's a difference there though. Like an autocomplete and a, random, like 1 in 6 or 1 in 8 chance to get some sort of answer on an 8 ball. It seems a lot different than a generated response from something that, yes, it does have the disclaimer that this information might not be accurate, but that in general, is crawling and getting data from the internet, and you would hope is reliably generating like more information based on your prompt from that data. So I would think that because there's more context around the prompt and the response, it's not really like an apples to apples comparison in my mind. Would you disagree?
So I think in practice, there is definitely a difference, but legally, I don't know if there is a difference because
Hmm.
if I ask the Magic 8 Ball, like I'm just using a tool, right? There's probably a disclosure on the Magic 8 Ball box that says this is for entertainment. Don't, take everything it says literally. And if I use ChatGPT, it's just a really fancy Magic 8 Ball. It's just a toy that a company makes and says, here, you can use that. And if you then put too much weight behind what it says, well, that's your fault. Just like if it's your fault if you put too much weight behind what a Magic 8 Ball says. I think
Mhm.
people do believe ChatGPT a lot more than a Magic 8 Balls, but legally, you might have your bases covered. I'm not sure. So that's an interesting
Hmm.
case. It's also interesting that the lawyers in the case, so Brian Hood's lawyers, basically made the argument, like their argument was ChatGPT didn't provide footnotes with links to sources, which is
Uh,
not it seems a little odd to me. And again, I'm not sure how Australian defamation law works, but at least in the US that seems a bit odd because I'm not sure how that changes much of anything.
yeah, I would also think like if you include a source, how many people are actually going to go and visit that source to verify it? It almost like strengthens the authenticity of that response in my mind. Like if I saw that this person did this and here are the sources for it, I would say, oh, okay, it has sources, it found them, and it kind of verified. I don't know that
Yeah, which is a
unless
good
I
point.
really wanted the information.
It's a good
Yeah,
point
go ahead.
because also Bard does that, right? Bard does give you links sometimes, and I can't remember what the query was, but there was some query. It was a legal-ish, tax-ish question that I asked Bard to see how it would do, and it gave me a wrong answer, but it gave me a link to a source, and I clicked on the source, and it was the source contradicted the answer that Bard gave me. So you sort
Hmm.
of could have exactly that sort of setup where Bard could say something that was incorrect, give a source that was correct, and then does that make it more or less liable? Again, I'm not even sure how the link thing necessarily comes into play for a defamation case, unless you're, yeah, I'm unclear there. All right, so before we close up, there's a few other interesting things that have just been ongoing for a little while here in the legal space, right? We have this class action lawsuit against GitHub Copilot for IP infringement. We have a class action lawsuit against Stability AI, DeviantArt, and Midjourney for copyright infringement. And we have another separate case from Getty Images suing Stability AI for copyright infringement. So multiple tests that are about to see what's going on with can you train a text to image generative AI model on copyrighted images or text to code in the case of GitHub Copilot. Um, and I'm very interested to see what the outcomes of those will be. Also, the Copyright Office, the US Copyright Office, released their policy, which it's not the same as a law, it is their sort of guidance for the industry. And it can be contested in a court, and maybe a court will find that that's not true, but this is sort of what they're saying at the moment. And they're saying a couple interesting things in terms of output of these systems. So if you take an image as output from Midjourney, so I put in a prompt, I get an image, I cannot copyright that image. If I make some slight modifications to that image, then I can copyright the modifications, but it's still not the base image. Someone else could take the same image, make similar modifications, and I can't do anything about that. I have to make substantial modification in order for me to be able to actually copyright that output. So that
What
could,
counts as
yeah, what
what
counts as
counts
substantial?
yeah.
That's an open question. It depends on the facts and circumstances and nuances of the case. One of the interesting things
Interesting.
is like, also they say that, a prompt in general is probably not sufficient to copyright the output. And they compare it to if you were to give direction to an artist, right? I tell an artist, hey, paint me in a boat going across the Rio Grande. I mean, I can't copyright their art based on the fact that I just gave them that description. Like the artist still created that. So they're saying basically that's what you're doing when you ask Midjourney or DeviantArt or Stable Diffusion to generate an image. I'm just commissioning an image, and it's produced by a machine. And due to long-running copyright law, you can't copyright output except if it's the output of the creative output of a human. So I think that'll
Mm.
be interesting. I wonder if that could play into the arguments that are made in the class action and Getty Images lawsuit, because you could argue things about how much you're benefiting from something if you're not able to copyright it. Maybe you still use it for commercial purposes. So I'm not saying there's nothing there, right? You still obviously have damages. You can derive commercial benefit, financial benefit from using the output of these systems, but you would have to truncate it before also copywriting it, right? I couldn't take an image as output and pass it off to Getty Images, say, right? I can't take Stable Diffusion output image, copyright it, and then sell it on Getty Images. Or I could, but it would be illegal.
Right. Yeah, and you definitely don't want to get caught up in that sort of lawsuit. I'm really interested in the different legal precedences that are about to be set and how that might end up shaping the development of some of these AI models, you know?
Yeah, it'll be very interesting developments. So, more things to come in future episodes.